He lived in plain sight, a quiet street, a normal house, a calm voice that answered every call. People trusted him with their futures, their retirements, their children's education. He knew their fears, their hopes, their weakest moments, and he never raised suspicion. Then one day he vanished. No struggle, no warning, no goodbye, just empty accounts, silent phones, and a town that could not understand how an ordinary man had erased himself so completely. For years, investigators searched for a ghost. Victims waited for answers that never came. Some lost everything. Some lost faith. Some never recovered. But the truth was far more unsettling than a simple disappearance, because this was not a man running from justice. This was a man proving a point. That identity can be manufactured, that trust can be engineered, and that control does not end when someone disappears. What followed would span a decade, stretch across state lines, and end with a revelation no one was prepared for. This is not a story about money. It is a story about belief. And once you hear it, you may never trust the same way again. A quiet town in upstate New York held the kind of stillness that felt eternal. Tree-lined streets curved gently around modest houses. Morning light spilled over sidewalks where children walked to school, and neighbors greeted each other with small waves. On a street like any other lived a man who would quietly change the lives of strangers across the country. His name was Daniel Harper, 42 years old, broad-shouldered but unassuming. He lived in a neat brick house that looked ordinary, but inside contained an entirely different world. On the surface, he was a financial consultant. To friends and family, he was dependable, intelligent, polite. He drank coffee every morning at the same cafe. He returned phone calls promptly. He offered advice freely. People trusted him without hesitation. Daniel's routine was comforting. He left the house each morning in a dark sedan, briefcase in hand, and returned by evening with a smile. He spoke warmly to neighbors about small victories or local news. Yet behind that smile existed a carefully constructed facade. It was a life built on persuasion, charm, and careful observation. Every word chosen to inspire confidence, every action designed to disarm suspicion. He had no criminal record, no history that could hint at the ripple of chaos he would soon leave behind. In town, people described him as a man who had the gift of understanding people. He listened, he empathized, and he learned the details of lives he would one day manipulate. Outside the town, in bustling cities and suburban neighborhoods, Daniel had built an invisible network. Clients who had never met him in person trusted him with their savings, with their hopes and dreams. He had a knack for crafting investment opportunities that seemed too perfect to resist. He spoke of returns, of stability, of security. He sent elegant emails with spreadsheets and contracts. He even offered occasional face-to-face meetings in rented offices that looked professional but were empty once he left. Those who invested never questioned his integrity. They spoke about him with admiration. Words like visionary, calm, and reliable followed him like a shadow. And yet the same charm that drew people close concealed the fact that not one of his investments was legitimate. Each deal a careful illusion, each promise a story told to mask the truth. Daniel had a life outside the con as well. On weekends he attended charity events and occasionally hosted book club discussions. He would donate anonymously to local causes. Friends and neighbors considered him philanthropic, thoughtful, considerate. No one suspected that the funds they believed came from his salary were actually moving through layers of accounts designed to obscure their origin. In the evenings, Daniel would sit at his kitchen table, laptop open, headphones on, eyes scanning spreadsheets and emails. He would draft letters, make calls, and weave stories for clients who believed their money was growing. Some were anxious retirees, hoping to secure their futures. Others were young families seeking a home. All were drawn into a web of trust that Daniel spun with meticulous care. The house itself reflected the duality of his life. On the outside it appeared lived-in, comfortable, welcoming. Inside it held hidden files, encrypted drives, and stacks of carefully organized documents. A calendar marked the timing of each communication with clients. Notes reminded him of personal details, birthdays, anniversaries, fears, ambitions. Each note a thread in a larger tapestry of persuasion. Despite his elaborate scheme, Daniel moved with caution. He avoided unnecessary risks. He monitored news about financial crimes closely. He understood how quickly a misstep could unravel everything. Yet even with his meticulous planning, he could not predict the one element that would eventually force the first cracks to appear. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Daniel met a new client, a young woman named Claire Benson. She had recently inherited a small fortune from a distant relative. She was cautious but curious. Daniel greeted her warmly, offered tea, and spoke softly about a conservative investment opportunity. She asked questions. He answered them with calm precision. By the end of the meeting, she was ready to trust him completely. Claire would later say she had never felt so understood by anyone. She described Daniel's presence as reassuring, like stepping into a world where every concern had been anticipated. She did not know that the very comfort she felt would eventually become the instrument of her loss. Even as Daniel built these connections, he maintained personal relationships. His sister lived in Boston. He called her twice a week. He had a handful of friends who knew only the public Daniel. He attended church occasionally, though he was private about his personal beliefs. Everyone saw the surface. No one glimpsed the hidden mechanics of his schemes. Yet, in the quiet of the night, behind closed doors, Daniel sometimes paused, sat back and considered the consequences. He imagined the faces of those who would never recover. He acknowledged the weight of deception, but treated it as a necessary component of the life he had chosen. To him, it was strategy, survival art, and no one could accuse a strategist of lacking dedication. The town itself never suspected the storm that was approaching. Morning joggers ran past the house unaware. Mail carriers delivered letters, oblivious to the hidden accounts. Children played in backyards while Daniel prepared the next layer of his plans. His presence was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in his appearance, extraordinary in his ability to manipulate. Then one evening, Daniel failed to return home. The sedan was gone. His lights did not flicker on at night. The neat rows of his kitchen counters remained untouched. No calls answered. No emails replied to. The town noticed only the absence of his routine. At first, neighbors assumed he was on a trip. Friends thought perhaps an emergency had delayed him. But days passed. Calls went unanswered. And slowly, unease began to settle like fog over the streets. The clients he had carefully nurtured began to wonder. Questions arose about transfers and promises. Claire Benson tried to call him repeatedly. Each attempt met with silence. Then small inconsistencies emerged. Emails bounced, office numbers disconnected. And for the first time, the reassuring presence of Daniel Harper was gone. Who was he really? Where had he gone? And what had he left behind? No one could answer these questions. The calm man who had seemed ordinary in every way, had vanished. And the lives he touched were about to be thrown into uncertainty, confusion, grief, and fear. As the sun set over the town, the streets emptied. Rain left puddles, reflecting the faint glow of street lamps. Windows darkened. And the story of Daniel Harper, the man who disappeared behind his words, had only just begun. The first cracks in the illusion were about to widen, and no one could predict the scope of the impact that would follow. Cliffhanger. Daniel Harper was gone, but the network he had built remained. Every trust carefully placed, now hung in the balance. Who had truly known him, and who would pay the price for believing in a man who was no longer there? The first sign that something was wrong did not come from the police. It came from silence. Silence inside bank accounts. Silence on phone lines. Silence where a calm, reassuring voice had always answered before. On a gray morning, in late October, the rain had not stopped for hours. Streets were slick. Skies hung low. Inside a small apartment in New Jersey, Claire Benson sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop. She refreshed her email again and again. Nothing. She tried Daniel Harper's number. Straight to voicemail. She listened to the greeting she had heard dozens of times. His voice steady, warm, professional. Then the line went dead. Claire told herself not to panic. Daniel had mentioned travel before, conferences, meetings, delays. Still something felt wrong. The money she had transferred 2 weeks earlier had not shown the promised update. The online portal Daniel had provided no longer loaded. By noon, she called the bank. The answer chilled her. The account number she provided did not exist in their system. Not frozen. Not pending. Gone. Across the country, similar moments were unfolding. In Florida, a retired couple waited for a quarterly report that never arrived. In Ohio, a small business owner realized a wire transfer had gone to an offshore account. In California, a single mother checked her savings and felt the floor drop out beneath her. None of them knew each other. All of them knew Daniel Harper. By the end of the week, local police departments began receiving calls, confused reports, missing money, a financial advisor who had vanished. At first, officers treated the cases as civil disputes, misunderstandings, investment losses. But as the complaints stacked up, a pattern emerged. Same name, same face, same carefully worded contracts. In upstate New York, police knocked on the door of Daniel's brick house. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. A neighbor explained that Daniel had not been seen in days. His car was gone. No lights, no sounds. Officers entered the house with permission from the property manager. Inside, everything was orderly. Too orderly. No signs of struggle. No personal items missing. Clothes still in the closet. Dishes clean and stacked. But something was wrong. The computer was gone. So were several file boxes. So was the safe. Investigators searched every room. Behind false panels, they found empty spaces where hard drives had once been mounted. The calendar on the wall stopped on the week Daniel disappeared. Every meeting crossed off in neat handwriting. No goodbye note. No explanation. The case shifted quickly. This was no accident. This was a disappearance by design. Detectives began tracing Daniel's digital footprint. What they found was overwhelming. Dozens of shell companies, accounts across multiple states, international transfers routed through layers of intermediaries. Each path ended in darkness. Witnesses were interviewed. Friends described Daniel as calm, reliable, generous. His sister in Boston broke down when informed. She had spoken to him 2 days before he vanished. Nothing unusual, no warning. She insisted he would never run. Clients told a different story. Emails that promised returns. Calls that reassured doubts. Documents that looked official but led nowhere. The deeper investigators dug, the more complex the web became. Daniel had anticipated scrutiny. Every move layered with misdirection. He had used burner phones, prepaid cards, and rented offices under false names. His real identity faded behind aliases and paperwork. The FBI was brought in. The estimated losses climbed into the millions. News outlets began reporting the story. A trusted advisor vanished. Victims left with nothing. Photos of Daniel appeared on screens across the country. The calm face now framed by words like fraud and fugitive. Yet there were no sightings. No credit card use. No confirmed travel records. Airports were checked. Border crossings reviewed. Nothing. It was as if Daniel had stepped out of existence. Some investigators believed he had help. Others thought he had planned this alone for years. Then, a strange detail surfaced. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Daniel had emptied his personal accounts. Not transferred. Withdrawn in cash. He had sold his car under a private sale. He had terminated his phone plan. Each action small. Together, unmistakable. This was not a man caught off guard. This was an exit. Victims gathered in online forums, sharing stories, comparing documents. Many realized for the first time how carefully Daniel had mirrored their fears and hopes. He had remembered names of children, spouses, illnesses. He had spoken about retirement, about stability, about safety. For some, the loss was financial. For others, it was everything. Marriages strained. Health declined. Trust shattered. People blamed themselves. Asked how they could have believed so easily, law enforcement followed leads that went nowhere. A possible sighting in Montreal. A rumor of a man matching Daniel's description in Nevada. Each tip collapsed under scrutiny. Then 6 months after his disappearance, a letter arrived at a police station in New York. No return address. Inside was a single page. Typed, no fingerprints. It read, "I did not vanish. You simply stopped seeing me." The letter contained no threats, no demands. Only one sentence and a date written beneath it. The date matched the day Daniel disappeared. The message was released to the public. Panic surged. Victims felt mocked. Investigators felt challenged. Was Daniel watching? Was he close? Or was this a final act of control meant to haunt those left behind? For years, the case went cold. Files were archived. Leads dried up. Some victims tried to rebuild. Others never recovered. Daniel Harper became a name whispered in cautionary tales. A reminder that trust could be weaponized. But unknown to everyone, something had shifted. A decade later, a junior analyst reviewing old fraud cases noticed an anomaly. A transaction that should not exist. A pattern that had been overlooked. A mistake too small for anyone to notice at the time. It was the first real sign that Daniel Harper might not be as untouchable as he believed. And the hunt was about to begin again. It began with a number that should not have existed. A forgotten transaction buried inside an archived report. A decimal point that did not belong. On a quiet afternoon, inside a federal records office, a junior analyst named Mark Ellison reviewed old fraud cases for a training project. Daniel Harper's file was marked closed, inactive, unresolved. Mark almost skipped it. Then he noticed something unusual. A microtransfer less than $50 routed through a dormant account 3 years after Daniel vanished. The transaction had been flagged automatically, then dismissed as a system error. No one had followed it. No one had questioned it. Until now. Mark traced the account. It was registered under a shell company Daniel had used briefly near the end of his scheme. The account should have been dead, yet the timestamp was real. The routing was intentional. Someone had accessed it. Mark escalated the finding. Within days, a small task force was reassembled. Old investigators were called back. New analysts joined. For the first time in a decade, Daniel Harper was more than a ghost. He was a presence. They mapped every known alias again, rebuilt timelines, cross-referenced travel data with financial movements. Patterns emerged that had not been visible before. Daniel had not vanished randomly. His exit followed a geographic logic. Francois moved west. Cash withdrawals clustered near border towns. Rental records under false names appeared briefly then disappeared. One detail stood out. A remote town in northern Arizona, sparse population, desert highways, endless sky, a place where people passed through but rarely stayed. Years earlier, a man using a different name had rented a small property there for 6 months. The lease was paid in cash. The landlord described him as quiet, polite, private. He worked nights, kept the curtains drawn. The physical description matched Daniel. Older now, thinner, hair shorter, but the eyes, according to the landlord, were unmistakable. Observant calculating. Investigators traveled to Arizona. The house was empty. Dust coated the floors. No personal items remained. But in the backyard, buried beneath dry soil, they found something unexpected. A rusted metal box. Inside were burner phones, long deactivated, and a notebook. The notebook changed everything. It was not a diary, it was a ledger of thoughts, observations about human behavior, notes on persuasion, on trust, on regret. Daniel wrote about the psychology of belief, how people wanted certainty more than truth, how kindness could be engineered, how disappearance was the final stage of control. But there were cracks. In later pages, Daniel wrote about fear, about aging, about the effort required to remain invisible. He mentioned dreams where he stood in rooms filled with faces that recognized him. He wrote that running forever was exhausting. One line stood out. "I am still watching them." Analysts linked the notebook to online activity, encrypted forums, anonymous posts discussing financial ethics and deception. One account resurfaced repeatedly. The language matched Daniel's cadence, the phrasing identical. He had been speaking into the void for years. Through the account, investigators traced an IP address. It led to a public library in rural Oregon. Security footage showed a man entering every Tuesday morning. Always at the same time, always alone. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. The walk, the posture, the stillness. Older now, gray at the temples, but unmistakable. Daniel Harper was alive. Law enforcement moved carefully. Surveillance teams were deployed. They followed him from a distance. He lived modestly in a trailer park under another name. He worked odd jobs, paid cash, spoke little. He had become invisible by becoming ordinary. They waited, they watched. Daniel did not know he had been found. Or perhaps he did. Perhaps that was why he had made the mistake years earlier. A trace left on purpose, a test. When agents moved in, they found no resistance. Daniel did not run, he did not speak. He simply closed his eyes and nodded, as if he had expected this moment all along. During interrogation, Daniel was calm, polite, measured. He admitted to the fraud without emotion. He explained his methods clinically, as if discussing a completed project. But when asked why he had vanished, he paused. He said disappearance was not about escape, it was about control. About leaving others with questions instead of answers. About proving that identity itself was negotiable. He showed no remorse publicly. Yet privately in recorded sessions, his voice shifted. He asked about his sister. About specific victims, by name, people he claimed he never forgot. The revelations stunned investigators. Daniel had monitored news about his case for years. He knew who suffered, who divorced, who lost homes, who took their own lives after losing everything. When asked why he never returned the money, his answer was chilling. Because returning it would end the story. The arrest sent shockwaves through the victims. Relief, anger, grief collided. Some wanted to confront him. Others could not bear to hear his voice again. Families gathered around televisions watching updates they had waited a decade for. But the case was not over. Daniel hinted at something else, a final act, something he had set in motion years earlier, a contingency that no one had discovered. He smiled for the first time and said the money was never the point. Investigators realized too late that the story still had one final turn, and whatever Daniel had planned next was already unfolding. The final move began quietly. No alarms, no headlines, just a letter. It arrived at 3 different locations on the same morning. one to the FBI task force, one to a victim's legal fund, one to Daniel Harper's sister in Boston. Each envelope identical, plain white, typed address, no return label. Inside was a single document, not a confession, not an apology. It was a map, a simple printed map of a remote area in northern Nevada, desert land, far from towns, marked with coordinates. Attached was a short note. One sentence: "You were always looking in the wrong place." Investigators confronted Daniel immediately. He did not resist. He did not deny sending the letters. He leaned back and closed his eyes as if relieved. He explained the contingency. Years earlier, Daniel had moved a portion of the stolen funds into a blind trust controlled by an automated legal structure. The money was not accessible to him, not accessible to law enforcement. It was timed, programmed to activate only after his capture or death. The purpose was not escape. It was legacy. The funds would be released in stages. Some to victims chosen randomly, some to charities that investigated financial abuse, some to organizations supporting fraud prevention, and some would never be recovered, intentionally locked forever. Daniel said this was his final lesson: control even in defeat. Chaos disguised as restitution. Investigators followed the coordinates. Buried beneath hardened desert soil, they found a reinforced container. Inside were documents, keys, and encrypted drives. The drives confirmed everything. The trust existed. The funds were real. Victims were notified. Emotions were mixed. Relief, anger, confusion. For some, the money would never replace what was lost. Years of stress, broken families, health ruined, trust destroyed. For others, it meant survival, a chance to breathe again. Daniel was sentenced in federal court. Decades in prison. No parole. He stood quietly as victims spoke. Some shouted, some cried. Some thanked him through tears they did not understand. When asked if he felt guilt, Daniel said something that would echo long after. He said guilt implies accident. The courtroom fell silent. His sister never visited him again. She accepted the restitution money and donated every dollar to counseling services for fraud victims. She said she needed distance from the man her brother had become, or perhaps always was. Years passed. The story faded from headlines. Daniel aged behind concrete walls. His health declined. His name became a case study in criminology courses. Analysts studied his methods. Investigators trained others using his playbook. Victims rebuilt slowly. Some moved, some remarried. Some still checked their accounts at night, fearing silence. The damage lingered. One winter morning, Daniel Harper was found unresponsive in his cell. Natural causes. No note, no final message. But months later, one last file surfaced, automatically released. A final scheduled transmission that no one had known existed. It was not addressed to authorities. It was addressed to the public. A recorded audio file. Daniel's voice calm even now. He spoke about identity. About how people are remembered not for who they are, but for the stories they leave behind. He said truth frightens people more than lies, and that trust once broken changes a person forever. The final line was simple. Ask yourself who you trust and why. The recording ended. No music, no explanation. For many, the case became more than a crime. It became a warning. That danger does not always look dangerous. That kindness can be constructed. That intelligence without empathy can be devastating. Daniel Harper never held a weapon. He never raised his voice. He never forced anyone. And yet the damage was profound. In quiet towns and crowded cities, people still remember his name. Not with fear, but with caution. As a reminder that some disappearances are not mysteries of location, but of identity. Because the most dangerous illusions are not the ones that vanish. They are the ones that feel safe.